Hi, I'm Jim Prall. I'm a senior systems programmer in the electrical and computer engineering department here at University of Toronto. And this talk is for Professor Bryan Karney's course CIV401 on turbines. And I'm going to be talking about wind power systems and wind turbines. A little history of getting power from the wind. People have been building systems to extract energy out of the wind for many, many centuries. And there were early uses for pumping water and for milling grain. That's the origin of the term windmill, which was using the energy of the wind to turn a millstone to grind grain. In ancient Iran, the earliest confirmed uses used a vertical axis layout. They had cloth vanes and drag rather than lift rotation. And in Renaissance into early modern Holland, they built wooden structures with 4 wooden blades, and these served as a frame for cloth sails, as we'll see in the next slide. So here's the images of the Persian design from about the 9th century CE. As I said, it uses a vertical axis, that is to say the rotation is around an axis straight up and down from the ground. This was used to pump water for irrigation and later applied to milling as well. As you can see in the lower image, which is a view from above looking down across the rotational axis, there's a block to keep each of the wind vanes in the path of the wind on one side of the rotation and to let them feather downwind in the other side of the rotation so that they create an unequal force, and as the wind passes over it, it creates a torque to cause this system to rotate and then turn the mill to grind the grain. And of course, what we all recognize as the classic image of a windmill in Holland, here's an example of a photo, a beautiful one. It's a wooden frame tower, and it has a roundhouse built on a brick foundation. It's about 1779, and the entire tower has to rotate to skew or slew the axis of rotation, which is now horizontal, to point into the wind. So somebody had to crank that. I suppose they just worked it by hand. I don't think they actually got to use the power of the wind to do that part. And then the 4 wooden blades work kind of like the mast of a sailboat, and each one has a wooden lattice off to one side so that they create what amounts to an airfoil. So you have a cloth sail that can be furled to stop the torque, to take away the torque and not run the system, so when you don't want it running. And then when you unfurl the cloth sails and put them out onto that frame, it supports them, creates what amounts to an airfoil. They work like a sail of a boat, and they cause each arm to exert a torque to cause the arm to rotate and then grind the grain. So here's a diagram from Learner's Dictionary that expresses the difference between a windmill and a wind turbine. So you'll pretty commonly hear people refer to electric wind turbines as windmills, just because that's a more familiar word. But to be really precise, when you're generating electricity from the wind, you're not milling grain, so it's a wind turbine and not a windmill. That brings us up to the present, where we are discussing wind turbines for generating electric power. This is a pretty well-studied mechanical and electrical engineering challenge. The power source is fluid flow across a pressure gradient, so in a way it's very much like the other kind of turbines you will have studied in your course, things like hydraulic turbines running from the pressure gradient of water over a hydraulic dam, and also from steam and air pressure turbines. So this one works that the blades are tapered foils, so they have a profile that changes through the length of the shaft. And they're creating lateral lift. They're not working by drag. So this isn't like a pinwheel where the wind blows on it and just simply pushes it along. They have to be shaped like the blades of a propeller or an airplane wing, and they use the Bernoulli principle to cause lift, and that lift goes around the circle of the blade's rotation. Then they're connected through a hub onto the power shaft, which is in a nacelle. That's just a covering that keeps the turbine generator out of the rain. And then that is on an axis that can rotate around to face into the wind on top of this fixed tower that you can see at the bottom. So the task here is to take a linear flow and convert that into rotational energy. So that's just like working with a turbine or the propeller of an airplane, which works in reverse. It takes torque and turns it into a linear flow out the other end. So the blades catch the wind and work as an airfoil. Then each of them adds torque. Hopefully you get them all working in the same direction at the same force, and then they're torquing to turn the shaft, and the shaft will turn the turbine to generate electricity. There are some that work by direct drive, but a lot of models in modern wind turbines use some gear reduction for that. So, as I said, this is a rotary dynamo, and it's pretty much like any power plant. So the power electronics and the mechanical design of the turbine can draw on our experience from those. Many of them now use electromagnetic generators. So I've been giving this talk for Professor Karney for some years now, and looking back, I had this chart that covered the growth in the size of wind turbines up to the beginning of this decade. And I've had to add some new circles onto this diagram because then wind turbines have continued to grow ever larger. So back in 2006, the largest model in the market was a 5 megawatt unit with a 126 meter rotor diameter. And now they're getting bigger and bigger. So 2011, we see 7 megawatt models. And this year in 2020, we're now looking at 14 megawatt models out on the market with a 220 plus meter rotor diameter. Generally speaking, the design will be that the diameter of the rotor and the height of the tower are equal so that the lower blade passes somewhat halfway down the tower. So the wind power industry is really pretty substantial. It's a growing, rapid, sustained growth. It's been growing at 23% year over year since 1990 up till now. There were an addition of 60 gigawatts of faceplate power capacity. That's a 10% growth in the past year. Solar PV is also growing quite rapidly, around 20% per year this past year. And wind is a major source of what you might call green jobs. So people are talking about that we have all these workers in fossil fuel industries that we're going to need to retrain and reallocate. And wind is already supporting something like 1.1 million jobs globally. And I've got a link on the site to the Global Wind Energy Council, which is a really good source of information. It's pretty much a mature industry worldwide. Here's a quote: "Onshore wind is a proven, mature technology with an extensive global supply chain, and offshore wind is also expected to grow rapidly." And that's from the International Energy Association, who have lots and lots of forecasts about where energy is headed. And that's a really important source. So there's numerous major manufacturers in the business. GE is in this, and then several European companies, Gamesa, Vestas, and we'll see some more. Wind is currently delivering something like 5 to 6% of worldwide power capacity. There are matured turbine designs in mass production now, at small mass production. We're not making millions of them at a time, but they have a serial production. And as I say, the engineers are working on making them larger each year. There's some economies of scale. You have to make one installation and do one electrical hookup, no matter how big the turbine is. So there are challenges as you get bigger that delivering really, really long blades and towers that come in pieces and then bolting them together on site, they're developing specialized construction equipment for these purposes. And here are some images of some of the really interesting ones for offshore. They have what are called offshore deployment vessels, and as of this year, 16 of these are in service. And you can see some images from the earlier models. The one on the bottom left looks kind of small by comparison. It's putting up a relatively small wind turbine offshore, I believe in Germany or the Netherlands. And on the right is an artist's conception using 3D ray tracing, but that's what they're hoping to do. And you can see that it has storage for a big stack of blades so that they can queue up that once the foundations are set, another vessel would create those. Then this one just does the erecting. It brings the tower with it, assembles the nacelle, puts the blades onto the hub, hooks the hub up to the nacelle, and the whole thing can be bolted together using this one specialized vessel. Here's some figures on which countries are in the lead around the world in the wind industry. This is looking at it by capacity and by production. So at the top in both categories, China has over 236 gigawatts of wind capacity installed, and that makes up 36% of what's out there in the world. The United States is second with 16% of the world's wind. That's about 105 gigawatts. And Germany comes in third. You can see Canada is there in ninth place, and we've got about 13 gigawatts, making up about 2.1% of all the wind turbines capacity in the world. In the middle column is figures from a couple of years ago, which is the energy produced, and China is again in the lead there. You can see that maybe the growth is outrun here, but China's figures, their production doesn't really keep up with the very large capacity they have. I suspect some of that is that China went in on a very large building spree in Outer Mongolia and ended up with really tough transmission problems and had quite a lot of curtailment in the last few years. You can see that the global industry has been growing steadily for decades now, and it's pretty close to an exponential curve that you can see right here. We're now at 650 gigawatts of installed capacity for wind turbines around the world. So we saw that we globally added almost 60 gigawatts of wind in 2019, and it's pretty encouraging. In this chart, you can see that the percent share of all global electricity generation from wind has been growing steadily since around year 2000, and solar has picked up in the last 11 or 12 years, still a smaller share. Nuclear has been a big share but is declining. And the contribution of other renewables, that would almost all be hydro, I would say, maybe a bit of biomass in that, had been pretty steady at around 20% of global electricity. The part that's really important and striking here is that coal, which is not low carbon at all, had been holding on quite continuously at 40%. And this is, in the context of the global demand itself has grown. So this is the percent share. And as you can see, coal has just now turned in the last 7 or 8 years to begin declining. People are forecasting a much sharper decline by coal over the next decades, partly thanks to Paris. And coal is no longer the least expensive way to generate electricity. Both wind and solar are beating new coal in many, many contexts. Here's another look at recent rates of growth in sources of renewable electricity. The quote says in first quarter of 2020, variable renewables in the form of solar PV and wind power reached 9% of global generation, up from 8% in the first quarter of 2019. And as you can see, this graph is done with bars for years 2018, 2019, and 2020. So solar had just a ridiculous growth rate going in the year 2018 of above 30% year over year. And starting from quite a small base, but it was in a really, really strong growth. And it's now just beginning to saturate a little bit, so it's down to growing at only 16% a year this year. Wind is holding very nice and steady at about 11% year over year growth 3 years in a row. The final delivered cost for various electricity generating sources is subject to lots and lots of issues about the context and are changing really, really rapidly for low carbon sources like wind and solar. So here's one look that some researchers did at the link listed down below that looks at the direct cost that you actually need to pay industrially, paying for financing the utility, putting the generator in, paying for the fuel for those that use fuel. And then a second level on the orange bars on top for the externalized costs, the ones that have not yet been reflected in the price that we pay at the electricity bill, but that society ends up paying. Both coal and oil have really, really substantial externalities, their costs for their impacts on climate as well as for particulates, air pollution, and a lot of other effects like that, that actually the external costs are more than the financial cost that we see, the price on the ticket that when you buy coal electricity on the grid. Wind power is actually competitive against coal even without factoring in those externalities in a bunch of different markets. It's getting closer in many other places. Coal would, of course, be pretty much priced out of the market if we factored in all of its externalities. That would include the CO2 emissions, coming up with some arbitrary number to reflect the social cost of carbon emissions. But then there's also real substantial economic damage from the particulate emissions driving asthma, heart attack, COPD. And then there's mercury and sulfate. The sulfur in coal, we're trying to find sources with lower sulfur in them, but when you burn it, the sulfur also oxidizes. You get SO4, and that turns into sulfuric acid in the atmosphere connecting with ground level ozone. Then it drives acid precipitation, damages the forests, crops. Mercury in the coal, just sort of a byproduct contaminant, gets lofted into the air, ends up running into waterways and oceans, and then it bioaccumulates in the sea, so that the effect is that tuna is really not safe for pregnant women to eat. And then there are all the effects of just getting the coal and the oil out of the ground in the first place, the mining and drilling side effects. So look at the particular reasons why people like wind power as one of the competitors in the mix of sources of electricity on the power grid. Wind is really a truly renewable resource. The wind just isn't ever going to go away. Wind turbines are zero emissions in operations. They don't consume any fuel and they don't emit any exhaust. And they produce that energy from the day you put them in, and it only takes maybe 3 to 6 months to recoup the amount of energy that you've delivered into the grid of how much you spent the energy producing and operating the wind turbine, even factoring in the energy that you're going to have to spend. You kind of bank up towards recycling in the end. And there's a good quote from the Wind Energy Coalition there. So one big strong point for both wind and solar is what we call security of supply. In contrast with fossil fuels, wind can't be used up, it can't be bought out, it can't be blockaded, there's no Straits of Hormuz for the wind, and it can't be embargoed, there's no OPEC for the wind either. And because it's a distributed plant with many, many small production systems, it's ideal for physical security. There's no one point of failure, so there's no real target for people with malicious intentions, sort of like we worry about people attacking a nuclear plant. So in the overall life cycle assessment of wind systems, wind turbines, their manufacturing can be about as green as other power generation systems. There is a real need to develop ways to do steel production with much less carbon emission, because steel is right now smelted using coking coal. You do a lot of combustion with CO2 emissions for that. And people are looking at alternatives for that. That's a bit outside the topic that I'm talking about now, but that's a thing you can find out. And when wind turbines are past their useful life, we have a process for retiring them. The steel tower is very straightforward to be either repurposed, put something else on top of that same tower, or recycle the steel. The turbine parts inside the generator could be scrapped. There's some interesting materials in there. Maybe there's some rare earths. The carbon fiber blades might be recyclable. Here's some research from 2004 talking about whether you can recycle the carbon fiber in blades. A lot has changed since then, and as of just this morning I found this link that there's a new group starting up in the UK called Sustainable Wind, SUSWind for short, and they're partnering with their National Energy Low Carbon Council with very interesting prospects that they plan to try to design wind turbine blade manufacturing processes to make the blades as amenable as possible to recycling. So that's quite exciting to see. Now to the story of wind power in Canada. Canada really has decent wind resources. We're, exposed to the Arctic, and we have really good temperature gradient from north to south, so we get strong winds. But the wind industry was really quite slow starting here compared to, say, the US and both Europe as well. There were no Canadian turbine makers until Ontario's Green Energy and Green Electricity Act. That act came into effect and was a landmark in North America. It was the first time that a province or a jurisdiction set up feed-in tariff rates to pay for green energy. That makes the electricity more viable to introduce, to produce, and put into the grid, because you get a committed contract for an attractive rate that works with the technology as it is available at the time, that you can make it pay. It was available for wind, solar, and biomass, but unfortunately it was quite short-lived. So Ontario's Green Energy, Green Electricity Act offered, as I said, feed-in tariff rates for green energy, and the rates were linked to performance of the project, that it had to have a specified percentage of domestic or Ontario content. And this was sort of an industrial policy thing to make it palatable. It was spending government money to pay people to subsidize better sources of electricity to help them get a foothold and begin introducing the supply chain. That kind of industrial policy doesn't sit well internationally. All the competing vendors that didn't get spots in Ontario ended up taking them to court in the World Trade Organization, challenging that kind of local content requirement as unfair on trade practice. In any case, I don't actually know if they succeeded at the WTO, but the Conservative government took over with Doug Ford, replacing Liberal Premier Kathleen Wynne, who had kept the Green Energy Act in effect. So one of Doug Ford's first acts was to just cancel it. He campaigned on that. In the course of setting it up, the government had negotiated with Samsung Industries of Korea. They were to locate a factory in Ontario for building the steel tubing to become parts of wind turbine towers. And they also worked with Siemens to bring in a blade manufacturing plant into Tillsonburg, Ontario. And that was quite successful. I understand that they actually assembled over 1,000 wind turbine blades. But unfortunately, the Tillsonburg plant closed in 2017. As the headline there shows, 340 green energy jobs left with it, again as a result of the change in government and the deletion, the repeal of this act. So across Canada, more reasons why wind wasn't one of the big factors until recently is that there were lots of other cheap power sources in place. Canada has a really long history with hydroelectricity. Niagara Falls was one of the first power plants in North America. Also, fossil fuels and nuclear have each enjoyed really strong historical subsidies. Canada's a fossil fuel producer as well, so there's a political interest in keeping that part of the power mix. The provincial utilities were each pretty slow embracing wind in general. They tended to favor what they had succeeded with in the past. So the major provincial utilities had specialized in hydro and nuclear, and also they'd built, substantial fossil infrastructure with coal and natural gas-fired plants. And this has been true around the world, that the big utilities did not champion wind as something that was not invented here. They were going to stick with what they knew how to do. In addition, we're a very wide country with lots of thinly populated areas, so we have a very wide dispersed power grid. And although the southern border near the U.S., there's strong grid connections, outside of that region, some of the best places where you might find the best wind resource, the power grid's fairly weak, and then that adds to the cost of getting the wind integrated into the power grid. Hydro and nuclear were quite well developed across Canada, and both of those are low carbon emitting sources. So since they both deal with addressing air quality concerns from fossil emissions as well, maybe there was just less clean air motivation to make people be interested in pushing to get the change to bring wind into Canada's power grid. So a big plus for wind power is the immediate effect you can see from getting wind in your power grid, that you're generally displacing coal-fired power generation with each unit of wind that you add. And Canada did have significant air quality problems with coal generation. Ontario had 4 really large coal power plants, and there was a pretty strong consensus across all parties in the early 2010s that we wanted to just phase out coal and stop burning it. We would keep natural gas as the last dispatchable fossil fuel source, but no coal. And it didn't become a political hot potato. All 3 parties agreed. So in the, by 2014 target, we'd already got it done. So the really large plant at Nanticoke and 3 other sites are now out of production, not burning any more coal. And because wind is pretty quick to build, it doesn't, 20-year lead times in a nuclear power plant, people make up their mind to start putting in wind. And if you can get supply, you can just start setting them up. And each wind that you add is that much less coal you burn. So another factor in wind's favor is that all the other low carbon sources are facing, some headwinds. So there's a shortage of sites for new large hydro across the world, really, and North America certainly. Hydro has significant ecological impacts. The migratory fish that come and spawn upstream have a tough time with really large hydro dams. You can build fish ladders, but how do you do a fish ladder around a site like Churchill Falls? And flooding land with the existing soil and plants leads to breakdown of organic matter in the absence of oxygen and emits methane. So there's actually pretty significant greenhouse gas emissions from existing hydroelectric sites. And it's pretty hard to quantify, but it's not zero. In addition, you're using up a lot of land for the impoundment, the area that you're flooding to create the reservoir for your hydro dam. And a lot of that is First Nations land, and the First Nations people have not been entirely on board with taking their land away and putting it underwater for electricity. In states in the U.S. that are major buyers of Canadian electricity, a lot of our electricity is produced at rates cheaper than the U.S. can do and then exported across the border. But you have to get contracts, and customers in the U.S. have picked up on these environmental issues about large hydro and have been campaigning. So there's been places like New York where the state didn't want to contract with a Canadian power producer to buy lots and lots of our hydro. For nuclear, there are enormous uncertainties. Nuclear is just really expensive to build, and it never seems to be able to come in at the price that it was originally projected. It tends to do, lots and lots of delays, and people perceive nuclear as being much, much higher risk than any of these other sources. Having seen the enormous disaster at Chernobyl, including, if you haven't seen it, you should look at the Netflix series, the dramatic reenactment of the Chernobyl accident. And then Fukushima, which was not really operator error, just a design problem that they didn't have a way to deal with an earthquake and a tsunami that flooded the backup generators that would have kept the pumps running even though the power grid was down. So in addition, since the dawn of the nuclear electricity industry, people have been struggling with what to do with spent fuel and with low-level radioactivity from retired, pipeline from within a nuclear plant. So, Canada has a program for dealing with that, and we're not having a lot of environmental contamination from the nuclear that we're running here. Canada has a pretty respectable nuclear industry, but the public is just not really on board with trying to expand nuclear on a large scale. So going back to large hydro, these are some of the things I just mentioned in passing in the last slide. Locally, First Nations have been opposed to proposals to put land underwater to produce impoundments for large hydro dams. And there are ecological impacts on fish runs. As I also mentioned, there's methane that is emitted when you impound existing topsoils. The plant matter breaks down and emits methane. And the Great Whale Project in northern Quebec was proposed to sell a lot of electricity into New York State, but the buyers in New York really put that out of business. It was a really strong, organized campaign that the New York legislature had to, put their agreement in, and the public wasn't on side with that. A much brighter night for hydro in Canada is that after many, many years of delays, two significant projects in the Maritimes are now finally coming into force. So there's the Lower Churchill Falls, a 3 gigawatt, not quite run-of-river, but a small-scale hydro, much less impoundment than the major Churchill Falls reservoir, put in by Nalcor and SNC, and the Gull Island Muskrat Falls staged just downriver from there. And here's an interesting quote. The Muskrat Falls project includes construction of an 824 megawatt hydro facility, 1,600 kilometers of transmission line along the province and associated electrical equipment. And as of last month, September 28th, Nalcor achieved first power from this project despite COVID-19. So they were worried they would have trouble finishing the construction, but they made it. The power is being routed around through Nova Scotia, and there's a story behind that. So I've turned my camera off so you can see this entire map and diagram with the legend. The project to take power from Lower Churchill Falls and from Muskrat Falls, it's not being routed through the power lines that serve the major existing Churchill Falls that's many decades old, running through Quebec, operated by Hydro-Quebec, and there's political issues behind that. So Labrador has chosen to run the power across the Labrador Strait into Newfoundland, down the peninsula into St. John's, and through Newfoundland's own transmission grid, and then through a maritime link underwater across the bay and over into Nova Scotia. Then from there, it's going through New Brunswick and available to sell power into Maine over existing transmission infrastructure. And the plot here is that Newfoundland felt really put out at how things worked out, that Churchill Falls lies within the territory of Labrador, which Newfoundland understands to be part of its own province. Don't ask Quebec what they say. That's very confusing. There's parts of people in Quebec who wish that Labrador had never been seceded, taken out of Quebec, and they'll draw maps where they paint Labrador the same color as Quebec. But never mind that part. The Churchill Falls transmission was just insanely efficient, worked out to a levelized cost of less than 1 cent per kilowatt hour. And Hydro-Quebec gets the revenue from that, and they're making a lot of money off of it. And they've got a 40-year contract, and Labrador didn't really end up getting any of the money out of that to speak of. So they wish that they'd gotten a better deal. It was a freely negotiated contract, and it's kind of sour grapes to say, oh, well, you were a bigger province and you threw your weight around. But they wanted to get back somehow to get more of the revenue out of this one, and so they couldn't play ball with Hydro-Quebec, so they ended up building their own transmission in what appears to be a much more roundabout way, and with more interesting and technically challenging things like AC transmission lines, underwater subsea components, and you can read about that technology on their website linked at the bottom. So with a few prospects for new large hydro across Canada, we can look at some activities that has taken place lately. There's been a big retrofit done for the Sir Adam Beck generating station at Niagara Falls. OPG has a page describing that. It allows a lot more water flow to the station capacity throughout the year. They bored a big 12.7 meter tunnel. It was completed in 2013, and it's now in service. There's also a pretty good Wikipedia page about the project. And they're currently working on upgrading and replacing the generator turbines in Surat and Bek. So instead of looking at large hydro across Canada, developers are looking into the possibilities for much smaller sites, just a lot more of them. You can do run of the river, where you don't create a dam and an impoundment, and you just take the flow that's there and run a turbine on it, a little bit like a tidal turbine. That was one of the options promoted in the Green Energy, Green Electricity Act. That's now repealed, so the possibility of feed-in tariff rates aren't there, but you could still look at doing this. In fact, dams that weren't built for hydro purposes have some impoundment and some waterhead that you could turn to small-scale hydro. Only 3% of the dams in North America have hydroelectric generation, and so there's potential for refitting many of the smaller ones if you just come up with a plan for hooking that up to the power grid. So in the midterm, one of the big benefits from going to wind power is reducing your CO2 emissions. Wind doesn't emit CO2. Canada had ratified the Kyoto Accord in the first decade of the 2000s, and we missed our targets that we set, and that was a sort of legally binding treaty. The Harper government withdrew us from the pact rather than make changes that would have allowed us to cut our emissions to what we'd said we would go for. There was below national, subnational scale pact called the Western Climate Initiative. Ontario and Quebec had joined in that, and that was a project towards sort of creating cap and trade. Then came the Paris Accord of 2015. Canada signed, the US, everybody signed it. It was a bit different. It wasn't a treaty, so it didn't need to go through Congresses and parliaments to be ratified. Instead, it was an agreement that everybody would just simply choose their own independent, nationally determined commitments and say, we're going to try, we're going to make the effort to lower our carbon emissions. And it was actually very successful. The only country to withdraw from it was after Donald Trump was elected. He said, oh, it was a really terrible deal. And he started the process to get out. In fact, they'd written it so that it was not so easy to withdraw once committed. So he signed the papers 1 year after he was inaugurated, and they needed a 3-year notice period. So his withdrawal really only took effect last week. Now he's lost the election, and Joe Biden is going to be president this coming January, and Biden has already signaled that he's planning to put the U.S. back into the Paris Agreement by presidential proclamation, and not needing to get it through Congress, and then everybody on Earth will be back in the Paris Accord. So another view of the long term is that getting into sustainable renewable resources gets you out of the fossil fuel era where we have been dependent on an exhaustible source. Oil and gas will eventually run out. Now, we've seen that people have been discovering ways to get more and more oil out of the ground, so we were not really hit with peak oil the way that people thought in the early 2000s we might, run into trouble where we had more demand than people could pump oil or gas to meet that demand. But the climate is the real constraining factor. We need a carbon neutral economy in the long run. And as one person put it, the Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones. So there are enough fossil fuel reserves left in the ground to really bake the climate. It would be catastrophic to dig them all up and burn them all. We need to, quote, leave it in the ground. So you can see the website leaveitintheground.org for more about that. As part of a transition to a post-fossil fuel economy, wind power can be a good, sustainable, long-term energy source and a significant part of the transition. It's genuinely inexhaustible. The sun will keep shining and keep creating those temperature gradients that drive the circulation of the Earth's atmosphere, and that's not going to go away. When you're building wind, you create green local jobs. You can build the wind turbines, you can assemble them, and you can maintain and operate them with people in your country. So previously I mentioned the idea of peak oil. There was one peak that was the really easy to extract oil. So easy and cheap oil is gone now. The places, Saudi Arabia has some reserves that they can extract at a few dollars a barrel, but everybody else is not finding any new oil that's that easy to get out. There's lots more reserves of fossil fuels that are not nearly exhausted. So coal appears to be like there's about 100 years worth of coal in the ground at the rate that we had been using it until we stopped expanding coal and began contracting it recently. But coal is just generally dirty. It contains contaminants like mercury, sulfur, and burning it emits small fine particulate matter that pollutes the air. And even though that pollution will wash out in the rain in a few weeks, while it's there, It's very, very destructive. It causes emphysema, COPD, asthma, and there's an enormous financial cost from that. Thousands of lives are lost every year as well from those kind of emissions. Coal mining is very destructive. We're now getting to the point where basically people tear an entire mountain off to get at the coal underneath it, pile all the toppings of the mountain into the valleys around, and they've devastated the landscape. So in coal country, people are really feeling the pain. The workers needed the jobs, but on the other hand, their entire landscape has been devastated. Burning coal, unless you come up with a real clean coal solution, is very carbon intensive. If you could do carbon capture and storage, where you combust the fuel, then you take the exhaust stream, separate out the carbon dioxide part, chill it, cool it to a liquid form, pump it underground. People have been working on that, but that adds to the cost, and so far all the pilot projects of that have kind of foundered. That might make much less coal economically recoverable if you commit to doing that. Really, the market for coal is contracting. It's practically vanished. More on the fossil fuels that are not exhausted. The non-conventional fossil fuels, bitumen or tar sands in Alberta, similar deposits in Venezuela. Across much of North America, there are shale deposits from which you can extract oil through hydraulic fracturing. And hydraulic fracturing techniques also work to get lots and lots of natural gas. The gas wells don't pump for very long, so you do a bunch of fracturing, you pump water and chemicals underground, under great pressure, you start getting some gas out, and in a few months you stopped it with that one and you have to drill another one. So parts of the US and other areas are now sort of pockmarked with little drill wellheads where they got some gas, and now they're done. This is a very high demand for water. You basically need to take a local water supply and then you contaminate it. You make it really gross and undrinkable, pump it in the ground, and these magic dilutants and fracturing agents and whatever make the gas come out from the tight rock. Then all that water gets produced again when you extract the gas. So the dirty contaminated water needs to be re-injected into other wells, and it seems to act as a lubricant because there's a consistent pattern. People are finding that there are clusters of very small earthquakes, very minor earthquakes, but a few significant ones in areas that had no natural seismic activity. They were not on fault lines. You're seeing this in the US Midwest. The other thing is that these chemicals can be toxic, and the companies like to say that they're trade secrets and won't disclose what they are. So have a look at the 2010 film by Josh Fox called Gasland. There's a link to the IMDb reviews of it there. So given that the Canadian tar sands are a really vast resource, why wouldn't we want to extract them? Well, there's enough carbon in there to create an enormous climate catastrophe if we take even a significant share of what's there. Canada's actually pretty heavily invested in this, putting in infrastructure for extraction and pipelines for delivering. It's also very carbon intensive to do the extraction, so people look at accounting for the carbon that you emit getting the fuel separately from the carbon that the customer is going to emit when they burn the fuel that you sell to them. And those customers might be in another country, so maybe Canada's emissions don't reflect all the carbon coming from the tar sands if the bitumen has been pipelined into the US or right now sent by train. The process for extracting it uses a lot of natural gas as a fuel for softening up and separating the bitumen. There's also danger to the local community through effects on the water supply. This also creates a lot of volatile compounds that get dissolved in water, tend to be carcinogenic, and they run up through into the Arctic. Putting the pipelines in has been extremely controversial, so there's been projects like the Keystone XL to take more Canadian bitumen diluted with solvent and send it down to refineries in the US. So far, the Keystone XL has gotten close, but it's not operating, and maybe Joe Biden's going to take another look at whether we want to have another shot at killing it. It was approved under the Trump administration, and I don't know how far they've gotten with, it's not on yet. So barring pipelines, people have been having to deliver bitumen by rail, and there was a really terrible tragedy in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, where people had a train full of heavy oil from the bitumen tar sands, parked the train and didn't set the brakes properly. It was at the top of a hill. The train started to roll on its own, ran down into the town, smashed into the town, caught fire, and a bunch of people died and houses were destroyed. And that concludes part A. I'm going to start in tomorrow with another part for you. Part B, we're going to talk about the business side of wind, how much wind are out there, so the idea of wind resource prospecting, and look at some things like levelized cost. And so I'll talk to you in another slideshow.